In 1997, the humid summer air clung to the small town of Oak Ridge like a damp shroud, carrying with it the uneasy murmur of teenagers' laughter and the faint pulse of music drifting from a house on Willow Lane where a party was in full swing. Among the faces blurred by alcohol and reckless abandon was Ethan Ward, 17 years old, tall and lean with a grin that had charmed teachers and infuriated rivals, his leather jacket slung casually over his shoulder as if he were immune to the weight of the world. Friends later recalled seeing him laughing on the porch just after midnight, waving off a ride home, insisting he wanted fresh air and a short walk across the football field that stretched between the school and his neighborhood. That was the last clear memory anyone could provide. A silhouette of youth vanishing into the shadows where streetlights flickered and silence pressed in close. By morning, whispers replaced laughter, and confusion tightened into fear when Ethan never arrived home. His mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed against the dawn chill, waiting for her boy who had always returned before sunrise, no matter what foolish adventures he pursued. When the police came, notebooks in hand and clipped voices heavy with procedure, they asked the questions that had no answers: who had walked with him, who had seen him leave, who had noticed anything unusual beyond the usual haze of beer and cigarette smoke. Rumors tangled themselves around the town like creeping ivy. Some swore Ethan had been drunk and wandered too far. Others claimed a fight broke out behind the gym, and darker suggestions implied he had discovered something he was never meant to see. Each story contradicted the last, and the lack of evidence made the ground beneath every theory crumble. Days stretched into weeks, and search parties combed the fields, the woods, even the shallow riverbank, turning up nothing but discarded bottles and scraps of paper that spoke only of teenagers desperate to forget responsibility. Margaret's voice grew raw from pleading with officers, her grief spilling into late-night radio shows and newspaper columns that printed Ethan's photograph under the word missing. His father, silent and stone-faced, aged years in weeks, carrying his sorrow in the slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands. Oak Ridge moved on, as towns often do when hope thins and fatigue sets in, but within the Ward household the air never lost the weight of absence, every empty chair and unopened bedroom door reminding them that Ethan's laughter had been stolen by the night, leaving behind only a question that echoed louder than any answer ever could. The weeks following Ethan Ward's disappearance in 1997 unfolded like a nightmare stretched too thin. The initial flurry of search parties and police interviews soon unraveling into a tangle of contradictions that left more questions than answers. Detectives sat teenagers down in stiff chairs beneath humming fluorescent lights, pens scratching as stories wavered, some classmates swearing they had seen Ethan leave the party alone, others insisting he had been pulled aside by someone near the back door, their details slipping and shifting like sand through desperate fingers. The inconsistencies gnawed at investigators, but without a body, without a clear witness, suspicion dissolved into fog, and the once urgent case began to lose its fire. Teachers and school staff, pressed by reporters and parents, gave polite but firm denials, each claiming ignorance, insisting the boy must have wandered off after too much drink, their rehearsed tones echoing like locked doors that refused to open. The community, once galvanized by candlelight vigils and flyer-covered telephone poles, slowly grew weary of grief, their voices lowering whenever Ethan's name was spoken, as if the silence itself were a defense against the unsolved. Margaret Ward, clinging to hope with shaking hands, sat in her kitchen night after night, her son's photograph propped against the sugar jar, staring at it until dawn painted the sky grey, while her husband withdrew into himself, a man hollowed out, who found no comfort in words, and sought refuge in endless hours at the factory. The case files grew thicker but emptier, filled with tips that led nowhere, footprints that evaporated, and rumors that poisoned any sense of clarity. By winter, the police moved Ethan's folder to the shelf labeled Cold Cases, the ink on his missing person flyer fading under the sun, its corners curling on bulletin boards that no longer caught many eyes. In Oak Ridge, new stories replaced the old. New parties were held, and the laughter of other teenagers filled the same streets, while Ethan's absence lingered like a shadow stretching too far for the light to touch. To the town he became another mystery to be spoken of in hushed tones, but to his family he remained a wound that never scabbed, a question that no silence could smother. Each year that passed only deepened the quiet, until his disappearance was less an investigation and more a scar etched into the town's memory. A scar no one wanted to touch for fear of reopening the pain. In 2025, the corridors of Oak Ridge High stood stripped of their usual noise, emptied for renovations that peeled away layers of forgotten history, exposing dust, peeling paint, and echoes of a generation long gone. Workers moved through the old wing with crowbars and drills, prying open doors that had not been touched in decades, when a janitor named Carl Jensen came across a row of lockers sealed shut with rust and neglect, their hinges fused like scars of time. With effort, he forced one open, the groan of metal piercing the silence of the abandoned hall, and as the door creaked wide, the stale scent of years gone by spilled out. Inside, resting as if it had been waiting all this time, was a leather jacket. Its black surface dulled but intact, the initials EW stitched in fraying thread on the collar, still visible beneath the dust. Carl froze, his breath catching in his throat, for he had grown up in Oak Ridge and knew the story of Ethan Ward, the boy who vanished after a party in 1997, the boy whose face had stared back from yellowing flyers and unsolved case bulletins that haunted the town for years. His hands trembled as he pulled the jacket free, brushing away cobwebs that clung to the sleeves. And for a moment he imagined he could still smell the faint trace of cologne, as though Ethan had just shrugged it off after a long night. Word of the discovery spread swiftly, leaping from workers' whispers to administrators' cautious calls. And before the day was done, the police had arrived, their gloves snapping as they lifted the jacket into evidence bags, cameras flashing like intrusive memories, capturing what should have been left in peace. Margaret Ward, now silver-haired and weary-eyed, received the phone call that unraveled her fragile routine, and when she heard the words, "We found something belonging to Ethan," her knees buckled as if the weight of decades had collapsed all at once. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the officer's steady voice describe the jacket, the initials, the condition, but her mind drifted back to the morning she last saw him wearing it, standing in the kitchen doorway with a grin, promising he would not be late. The town, jolted awake from years of slumber, whispered once more about the boy who had disappeared into the night, and the rusted locker became more than a relic of the past. It became a doorway cracked open, spilling secrets into the present, demanding that silence no longer be allowed to hold dominion over Ethan's story. The news of the jacket spread through Oak Ridge like fire across dry grass, igniting memories that many had long tried to bury. And within hours, the story was no longer just a line in a police report, but the leading headline on local stations. Each broadcaster carefully pronouncing the name Ethan Ward, as though resurrecting a ghost. Margaret Ward, her hair now white and her frame thinner with age, sat in her small living room when the phone began to ring incessantly, reporters eager for a quote, neighbors offering condolences laced with curiosity, and strangers who had once been classmates of Ethan leaving shaky voicemails about how they had always known something was wrong. Margaret clutched the receiver with trembling hands, listening to questions that cut her open again, each one pulling her back to 1997, to the kitchen doorway where Ethan had smiled before disappearing forever, to the empty chair at the dinner table that had never been filled. The discovery of the jacket was more than fabric and thread. It was a spark thrown into the shadows of Oakridge, rekindling suspicion that the town itself had conspired in silence, that the school had locked away more than just a piece of clothing. Parents who once shook their heads at the tragedy now found themselves whispering about the teachers who left abruptly, about the students who moved out of town within a year of Ethan's vanishing, about the strange hush that had followed the initial investigation. At the diner on Main Street, old men stirred their coffee with uneasy hands while recalling the parties of that summer, their voices low but urgent, as though speaking too loudly might summon the weight of guilt they had all carried silently. For Margaret, the resurgence of interest brought both torment and a glimmer of hope. For though the pain cut like freshly broken glass, there was also the faint possibility that the truth might finally surface after decades of lies and omissions. She looked out her window as news vans lined the street, their antennas reaching like skeletal fingers into the grey sky, and wondered whether Ethan's voice, lost in the static of time, might be speaking again through the jacket, urging her not to stop searching. The town, once resigned to silence, now stirred uneasily, and the ghost of a boy taken too soon seemed to walk its streets once more, reminding every soul that Oakridge had unfinished business buried within its heart. When investigators unsealed the evidence bag and carefully searched the pockets of Ethan Ward's weathered leather jacket, their gloved fingers brushed against something brittle and folded, a fragment of the past pressed flat by years of silence, and when they drew it out, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was a slip of lined notebook paper, yellowed at the edges and creased into quarters, the ink faint but legible, the handwriting jagged as though it had been written in haste by a hand trembling with fear. The words scrawled across it were chilling in their simplicity. 3 names, each belonging to classmates who had attended the party that summer night in 1997, followed by a single phrase that tightened the air around the officers like a noose. Don't let them find out. The names leapt off the page, familiar to detectives who had studied the old case files. Names that had surfaced in interviews but never tied to anything of substance. Names that suddenly carried the weight of accusation. As word of the discovery spread, speculation rippled outward, tongues wagging in diners, grocery store aisles, and church pews, each person wondering what those teenagers, now adults with families and careers, had hidden for nearly 3 decades. Margaret Ward was summoned to the station, her heart thudding painfully as she was shown the note, and though her eyes blurred with tears, she recognized the names instantly, recalling birthday parties, school plays, and sleepovers, when Ethan had mentioned them as though they were nothing more than ordinary companions. The thought that they might have been tied to his disappearance sent a shiver through her, like cold water poured down her spine, and she gripped the edge of the table for strength. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances, for the note was not a confession, not a map, but it was a seed of suspicion buried in the soil of truth, waiting all these years to be uncovered. The words, "Don't let them find out," seemed to echo through the sterile walls of the station, carrying with them a warning, a plea, or perhaps a threat, and no one could be certain which it was. In the town of Oakridge, where silence had long reigned, the note was a thunderclap, shattering the illusion that Ethan's disappearance had been a random tragedy, and reminding everyone that secrets have a way of surfacing even when locked away in rusted metal for nearly 30 years. The reopening of Ethan Ward's case in 2025 brought detectives back to familiar names. Classmates who had once been nervous teenagers in 1997 and were now weary adults, summoned again to answer questions they thought had been buried by time. and as they sat beneath the harsh glow of interrogation lights, cracks began to appear in the stories they had clung to for nearly 3 decades. One after another, the polished accounts of an ordinary party unraveled, giving way to reluctant admissions that the night had been far from innocent, that bottles of cheap liquor had circulated freely, that lines of powder had been cut on the back steps while music thudded through the walls, and that tempers, already fueled by jealousy and intoxication, had flared into a fight that several had tried to forget. Voices quavered as old guilt surfaced, and names once spoken casually in friendship were now whispered with dread. For the note found in Ethan's jacket had cast a long shadow over every memory, and none could deny that something darker than teenage mischief had lingered in the air that night. Some confessed they had seen Ethan arguing with others outside the garage, his voice sharp with anger, his hands clenched in defiance, while others admitted they had avoided the confrontation altogether, too afraid to get involved. The contradictions piled up, thick and suffocating, until it became clear that no one had told the full truth in 1997, that each story had been carefully polished to protect themselves, to protect one another, and perhaps to hide something none dared to face. Detectives pressed harder, their questions relentless, and the facade of innocence crumbled like brittle plaster, exposing the rot beneath. Margaret Ward, though not present in the interviews, felt the reverberations in the hushed phone calls she received from neighbors, in the sideways glances cast when she went to the grocery store, as if the entire town had suddenly remembered its complicity in staying silent. The fight, the drugs, the alcohol, all painted a picture far removed from the harmless gathering so many had once described, and with each revelation, the image of Ethan walking away alone seemed less plausible, less believable, swallowed instead by a narrative of betrayal and fear. Oak Ridge, once content to let the case wither in cold files, now found itself staring at the raw truth, that the night Ethan disappeared had been steeped in shadows of secrecy, and that silence had served as a shelter for guilt, leaving behind a wound that had never truly healed. As detectives sifted through the tangled web of confessions and contradictions that had begun to surface, one name rose again with an unease that settled like fog over Oak Ridge, a name that had once been spoken with authority but now carried suspicion. Mr. Collins, the young teacher assigned to chaperone the party on that fateful night in 1997. In the early days after Ethan's disappearance, Collins had been questioned briefly, his answers crisp and professional, yet lacking in warmth, as though rehearsed, and while no evidence had tied him to wrongdoing, whispers had followed him like shadows. In 1998, less than a year after Ethan vanished, Collins left town suddenly. Resigning from his teaching post and citing family matters, though some said he had grown restless and others claimed he had been pressured to step aside. His departure had always seemed abrupt, but it was only now, in 2025, with the discovery of Ethan's jacket and the resurfacing of long-buried details, that the pieces began to look less like coincidence and more like the outline of a hidden truth. Old classmates remembered seeing Ethan on the back porch that night, his voice sharp, his expression tense, and standing opposite him, tall and composed in his collared shirt, was Mr. Collins, leaning in close as though warning or threatening, though no one could recall the words exchanged. Some swore Ethan had accused him of something, while others insisted it was nothing more than a disagreement over curfews, but the unease in their voices betrayed the fact that their memories carried weight they had long avoided confronting. Parents remembered how Collins had seemed oddly defensive in the days after the disappearance, volunteering his alibi even when it was not requested, reminding others that he had left the party early, before anything had gone wrong. Margaret Ward, upon hearing his name resurface, felt her stomach twist, for she remembered her son mentioning him in the weeks before he disappeared, saying that Collins seemed too close to some of the older students, that his presence at their gatherings made Ethan uneasy. The rumors swirled louder now, filling the town with speculation, painting Collins not as the promising teacher who had once inspired trust, but as a figure cloaked in suspicion, a man who had walked away from Oak Ridge at the precise moment questions should have been asked the hardest. In his absence, the silence seemed damning, and every unspoken word became a shadow that stretched further into the mystery of Ethan Ward's final night. Margaret Ward had lived with grief for so long that it had become the rhythm of her days. But the discovery of Ethan's jacket in 2025 had awakened something fierce within her, a resolve that pressed against her age and weariness, demanding that she not allow the silence to return and swallow the truth once more. She spread Ethan's yearbooks across her kitchen table, their worn covers creased from years of handling. Photographs of smiling teenagers staring back at her like ghosts frozen in time, and she traced his face with trembling fingers, remembering the warmth of his laughter, the way he had once slouched in his chair, pretending not to care about grades or the future. She combed through boxes of old photographs, the edges curled and faded, some capturing Ethan at birthday parties with the very classmates whose names now lay on that chilling note, and others where his arm was thrown around friends who looked away from the camera as if caught off guard, their expressions unsettled in hindsight. She scoured the town library, pulling old newspapers from dusty archives, searching for anything connected to that summer of 1997, piecing together fragments of articles that hinted at disturbances near Willow Lane, noise complaints that were brushed off, and whispers about police warnings never officially recorded. Margaret's nights stretched into dawn as she compared names, timelines, and notes, pinning them to corkboards in her small den, transforming her home into an amateur detective's sanctuary where string and paper formed a map of suspicion. More than once she found herself pausing over Ethan's scrawled handwriting in his school notebooks, reminders of math assignments or lists of music tapes he wanted to buy, and tucked among them were brief scribbles she had once ignored, cryptic references to Collins and the guys or to something wrong at the parties. Each note now felt like a flare fired across time, warning her that Ethan had stumbled upon something larger than teenage recklessness, something illicit that frightened him enough to confide only in scraps of paper. Neighbors shook their heads when they saw her hunched in the library or hauling boxes of records to her car, some pitying her, others whispering that she had lost herself to obsession. But Margaret ignored them all, for she knew the difference between clinging to grief and pursuing justice. Her determination was not madness. It was the voice of a mother who had waited too long for answers, and she vowed that this time Oak Ridge would not escape the truth. The renovations at Oak Ridge High had already revealed more secrets than the town was prepared to face. But in the spring of 2025, the workmen stumbled upon something that seemed less like a relic of decay and more like a crime sealed in brick and mortar. A narrow storage room hidden behind a wall of plaster near the row of rusted lockers where Ethan's jacket had been discovered. The discovery came when a sledgehammer broke through what should have been solid wall, revealing a hollow echo and a thin draft of stale air that carried the scent of mildew and rot. As the dust cleared, a doorway emerged, its edges jagged, its frame buried in layers of paint, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase its existence. Inside, the light of a single work lamp revealed a space no larger than a walk-in closet, littered with beer bottles turned cloudy with age, torn fragments of flyers that had once advertised parties in 1997, and graffiti scratched into the concrete walls with the frantic scrawl of teenage hands. At first, the room seemed nothing more than a forgotten hangout spot, a secret hideaway where students had gathered in defiance of authority. But the discovery that froze every breath came from the floor itself, dark stains embedded in the concrete. Stains that forensic teams would later confirm carried the unmistakable fingerprint of Ethan Ward's DNA. The revelation thundered through Oak Ridge like a storm, shattering the already fragile veil of innocence that had cloaked that night, transforming Ethan's disappearance from a mystery of vanishing footsteps into the certainty of violence. Margaret Ward, standing in the school corridor when detectives informed her, pressed her hand against the cinder block wall as though she could feel her son's suffering lingering in the cold stone, tears spilling silently down her cheeks as her body trembled with both grief and vindication. The town that had whispered for years now roared with speculation, every resident recalling who had been at the party, who had lingered near the old wing, who might have carried the secret of that hidden room like a brand on their conscience. The bottles and papers were collected as evidence, each piece of trash transformed into sacred artifact, each scrap holding the potential to untangle decades of silence. Oak Ridge could no longer pretend Ethan had simply walked away into the night, for the blood on that floor spoke more loudly than any rumor, and the walls that had sealed the room had also sealed away the truth, waiting for the day when the past would no longer stay buried. The threads Margaret Ward had been pulling finally began to knot into something undeniable, when whispers reached her about a secret pact made in the aftermath of that night in 1997, a vow of silence forged between three of Ethan's closest friends, Lena Matthews, Travis Cole, and Jordan Hale, who had carried the weight of that promise for nearly 3 decades. The discovery came not from police files, but from the hesitant words of an old classmate who could no longer bear the guilt of knowing pieces of the truth without ever speaking them. And as Margaret pressed for more, the story unfolded like a confession wrung from trembling lips. Lena, Travis, and Jordan had sworn never to reveal what they saw or what they did, sealing their silence in fear of what exposure might bring, not only for themselves, but for the fragile illusion of normalcy the town so desperately wanted to preserve. The pact had followed them into adulthood like a shadow that grew longer with every passing year, poisoning their marriages, fracturing their friendships, and haunting their dreams with flashes of blood, shouting, and Ethan's face caught in a moment of terror. Margaret, holding their names on her tongue like a bitter taste, found herself recalling photographs of them together in yearbooks, their arms draped around Ethan with youthful ease, never hinting at the dread they would later carry in secret. When detectives confronted Lena, her composure cracked within minutes, tears spilling as she admitted that the three of them had bound themselves to silence after realizing that the truth could ruin their lives. And though she refused at first to detail what exactly happened, her eyes betrayed the torment of someone who had relived it every day since. Travis, weakened by illness and consumed by regret, spoke in fragments, describing how the fight had spiraled and how panic had eclipsed reason, while Jordan remained rigid, denying even as the evidence mounted, his denial more desperate than convincing. Margaret sat across from them in the station, her presence a reminder that their silence had not buried the past, only delayed the reckoning, and she could see in their downcast faces that the years of fear had been punishment enough to hollow them out long before the law could intervene. The pact, once meant to protect them, had instead chained them to guilt, and as the truth crept closer to the surface, it was clear that no vow could outlast the determination of a mother searching for her son. Travis Cole sat propped up in a hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic thick in the air, his body ravaged by the cancer that had reduced him to little more than skin and bone. And as detectives leaned in with quiet urgency, he finally loosened the words he had carried, like shackles since 1997. His voice cracked, raspy and weak, but steady enough to unravel the truth that had festered in silence for nearly 30 years, and Margaret Ward, seated nearby with hands clasped tight in her lap, braced herself for what she had both longed for and dreaded. Travis admitted that Ethan had stumbled onto something that night, not the innocent chaos of teenagers drunk on rebellion, but something far more sinister. For Mr. Collins, the young teacher trusted to watch over them, had been supplying drugs to students, slipping bags and pills into eager hands under the cover of music and laughter. Ethan, bold and unafraid even in youth, confronted him near the back steps, his voice raised in defiance, his anger raw, and in that moment the mask of respectability Collins wore cracked. A scuffle broke out, heated and sudden. Fists clashing, shouts echoing, and in the chaos Ethan was struck hard, collapsing to the ground with a sound that silenced those who witnessed it. Travis's eyes welled as he described how panic gripped them, how Lena screamed and Jordan begged Collins to stop, but fear overrode reason, and instead of calling for help, they chose silence, binding themselves to it in the hours that followed. Ethan was alive at first, groaning and clutching his side, but the fear of exposure, of futures destroyed, held them frozen, and Collins, his voice sharp and commanding, convinced them to keep quiet, to protect themselves by burying the truth. Margaret felt her chest tighten, every word like a blade reopening wounds she had nursed for decades, but she forced herself to listen, to absorb the weight of what had been stolen. Travis's confession spilled like water from a broken dam, his voice faltering as he admitted that not a day had passed when he had not seen Ethan's face in his dreams, accusing, haunting, demanding justice. As machines beeped softly around him, he whispered that he could no longer carry the burden, that death was near, and with it came the need to cleanse his soul. Margaret reached for his hand, her grip trembling, her eyes brimming, and in that fragile connection between a grieving mother and a dying man, the silence that had once protected guilt began to crumble into truth. The confession from Travis opened a door that Margaret Ward had dreaded yet demanded, a door that led into the heart of betrayal and fear, and from there the truth emerged piece by piece, each fragment heavier than the last. In the frantic hours after Ethan was struck down that night in 1997, Collins and the teenagers who had witnessed the scuffle moved like people possessed, their choices not guided by reason or compassion but by panic and self-preservation. Ethan's jacket and school bag, stained and incriminating, were shoved into a locker in the old wing, its door slammed and sealed as though hiding cloth and paper could erase the life to which they belonged. Collins, ever the authority figure, used his voice like a blade, cutting through their terror with orders, telling them that no one could ever know, that the future of each student, and perhaps his own career, depended on silence. Together, with shaking hands and eyes wet from both fear and tears, they carried Ethan's limp body across the shadowed grounds of Oak Ridge High, the distant hum of crickets and the flicker of security lights bearing silent witness. Near the old football field, half forgotten and already marked for renovations, they dragged him to a shallow pit where piles of construction materials had been stacked, wood and concrete debris covering him as though the earth itself was being forced to swallow the secret. The field, once a place of cheering crowds and youthful triumph, became instead a grave of silence, its soil heavy with the weight of lies. For years, children played on the new turf that was laid above it, never knowing that beneath their running feet lay the remains of a boy their parents still whispered about in hushed tones. Margaret listened as detectives explained what Travis's confession had unveiled, her body rigid, her breath shallow, each word confirming the horror she had long suspected but never been able to prove. She closed her eyes and could almost see her son lying there beneath layers of dirt and rubble, his watch still on his wrist, his smile stolen forever. The jacket found in the locker was no longer just a haunting relic, but a deliberate act of concealment, The final piece of evidence that tethered Ethan's disappearance to the hands of those who had sworn to protect him. Oakridge, once content to live with questions, now had to face the answers, and those answers reeked of guilt, fear, and betrayal. When the decision was made to excavate the old football field in 2025, the heavy machinery moved across the soil with a kind of solemn weight, as if the ground itself resisted surrendering the truth it had guarded for nearly 3 decades. Workers stood silent as backhoes tore into the earth, their engines growling against years of silence, until the first fragments of bone surfaced beneath the dirt, pale against the dark soil, fragile and unmistakable in their finality. The site was quickly cordoned off, investigators kneeling in the dust with brushes and careful hands, each movement reverent, uncovering piece by piece the skeletal remains of Ethan Ward. Forensic teams worked swiftly, their tools precise, and when the DNA results returned, the confirmation struck like a bell tolling across Oakridge. Undeniable and absolute. The boy who had walked away from a party in 1997 had been here all along, buried beneath the cheers and footsteps of generations who never knew they were playing over his grave. Margaret Ward, summoned to the site, clutched the railing as her legs faltered, her tears falling freely as detectives showed her the item found nestled among the bones, a broken wristwatch with its hands frozen at a time no one could explain. The same watch she had given Ethan on his 17th birthday, its engraving worn but still legible, a mother's gift now returned in pieces. She pressed the watch to her chest, sobbing quietly, every memory of that day flooding back. The cake with its uneven candles, Ethan's teasing grin as he promised to never take it off, and the embrace that had unknowingly been their last. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, stripping away the comfort of rumors and replacing them with the hard truth of mortality, the undeniable evidence of betrayal and concealment. Teachers who had once denied knowing anything found themselves questioned anew. Students now grown into weary adults felt their carefully guarded lies closing in, and the town of Oakridge, long defined by whispers, was forced to confront the body that silence had buried. For Margaret, there was a hollow kind of peace in the confirmation. The relentless question of, "Where is he?" finally answered, yet the answer cut deeper than the question ever had. She stood at the edge of the field as the remains were lifted carefully into evidence bags, knowing her son's story had been unearthed at last, but also knowing the truth had arrived too late to give him back the life stolen from him. When the warrant was issued in 2025, the man once known as Mr. Collins was living under a different name in another state. His hair grey, his posture bent with age, but no disguise could shield him from the shadow of Oakridge that had stretched across nearly 3 decades to finally claim him. Authorities tracked him down in a modest suburban home, and neighbors watched in disbelief as the man they had known as a polite retiree was led away in handcuffs, the past catching up with him in the flash of camera lights and the thunder of reporters' questions. The extradition back to Oakridge was swift, and when he stepped off the transport vehicle, the air seemed to crackle with the weight of betrayal. The sight of him in shackles, a jarring reminder that the trusted young teacher who once oversaw dances and parties had instead been the architect of silence. Lena Matthews and Jordan Hale, unable to withstand the growing mountain of evidence and the gnawing guilt that had haunted them since 1997, finally broke their silence in full, their testimonies painting a picture of fear, coercion, and complicity, confessing how Collins had demanded their silence, how they had chosen protection of themselves over the life of their friend. In the courtroom, Margaret Ward sat with her hands clasped tight, listening to every word with tears streaming down her face, torn between rage at the man who had taken her son and sorrow for the children who had carried the burden of his crime for so long. The community, Once content to let the case fade into the fog of time, now reeled as the truth spread like wildfire, every parent wondering how a man entrusted with their children could have been the one to betray them so completely. The betrayal seeped into the marrow of Oak Ridge, shaking the foundations of its schools, its institutions, its trust, as townspeople filled pews and diner booths with whispers of shame and disbelief. Margaret found little comfort in the arrest, for no bars could bring back Ethan. But there was a grim satisfaction in watching the facade of Collins collapse under the weight of his own lies, his once proud figure reduced to a weary criminal finally exposed. The verdict was still distant, but the town had already been changed forever. For the truth, however delayed, had shattered the silence, and Oak Ridge could never again pretend innocence had lived within its walls. The morning air in Oak Ridge was cool and still, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the skin. When Margaret Ward made her way through the rows of gravestones toward the newly marked resting place of her son in the spring of 2025, the grass had only just begun to take root over the fresh soil, and the polished headstone gleamed faintly in the light, etched with Ethan's name, his birth and death years carved into stone that felt too permanent, too final for a life that had been cut short at 17. In her hands she carried the leather jacket that had haunted the town, the jacket once locked away in rusted silence. And as she laid it gently across the top of the grave, the fabric seemed to fold naturally, as though waiting all these years for this moment of return. Margaret's breath trembled as she whispered a prayer, her voice breaking, yet there was a calmness threaded through her grief, a peace she had not known since 1997, when her son vanished into the night and left her to carry an endless burden of questions. Around her, neighbors and friends gathered in quiet solidarity, some holding flowers, others with bowed heads, and even those who had once whispered rumors now stood solemn, the weight of truth settling on them all. The silence that had cloaked Oak Ridge for nearly 30 years was broken, not by shouts or accusations, but by the stillness of acknowledgement, the recognition that justice had come late, but not too late to honor Ethan's memory. Margaret touched the stone, her fingers tracing the letters, and she felt the years of searching, the endless nights of staring into darkness, slowly lift from her shoulders. The truth had devastated her, had torn open wounds that would never truly heal. But it had also given her something she thought she would never hold again: closure. Ethan's story had been told, his laughter remembered not as a fading echo but as a presence stitched into the very fabric of the town, a reminder of innocence betrayed and silence finally shattered. As the sun rose higher, casting a soft glow over the cemetery, Margaret turned and saw children playing near the gates, their voices ringing with life, and she allowed herself a small smile through her tears. Ethan's name would no longer be spoken only in hushed tones or forgotten files. It would live in memory, in truth, and in the quiet peace that comes when a story, however tragic, is finally complete.